Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. Today we have the 8th Scottish opinion poll of 2025. We're going to dig into the results, what it means for the parties, what it would mean in an actual election if the results of the poll were to be replicated. A couple of interesting lines about constitutional preferences as well. And of course, this poll will form the backdrop to the Hamilton, Larkhall, and Stonehouse by election. Voters go to the polls there on Thursday. And taking it away from all matters Scottish politics, Alex and myself will pick a couple of stories from this morning's papers, which make interesting reading. And we'll close with to kick out or not to kick out? When should badly behaved MPs or MSPs be asked to leave the chamber? But let's start with the most latest Scottish opinion poll. It's in Alex's newspaper this morning, the Sunday Times. Alex, just take us over the findings and indeed what you think of it.
Yeah, good morning, Bernard. Lovely to be chatting with you as always. Yes, this is a Norstat poll for the Sunday Times, and the paper has gone, I think, understandably in the circumstances, for the headline finding that on the constitutional question, should Scotland be an independent country or not, it finds a record high in recent years for the yes proposition. 54% of people want it, supporting independence, and 46 supporting the unionist status quo. As I say, that's a record high for Norstat in the last 4 or 5 years. We can talk about this in a moment as to how significant it is. The poll also finds that were Nigel Farage to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom after the next general election, which is something that a lot of people are hyping up at present, that support for independence would increase again up to around 58% in that hypothetical situation, which is, of course, really quite close to the 60% threshold that has somehow mysteriously become the kind of tipping point on the national question. And that's a proposition accepted by most of the political parties at present. In terms of next year's Holyrood election, and these are perhaps more concrete polling findings, it is to some extent as you were, in reverse order of popularity. The poll finds that on the constituency part of the ballot, the Greens would be expected to win 7% of votes, the Liberal Democrats 8%, the Conservatives a miserable 13%, Reform UK, the bright new shiny entrant into Scotland's multi-party universe, 18%. The Labour Party, 19%, and John Swinney's SNP, 33%. Now, this is broadly consistent with previous opinion polls from other pollsters in recent months, which does suggest that in certain respects, the will of the Scottish people is at present settled, is it not, Bernard?
Well, it's settled in that it's a plague in all your houses would be the way in which, a plague in everybody's house apart from Reform. To be absolutely fair to them, I mean the SNP finding at 33% in this poll is actually the lowest share of the vote. I mean, there's been 8 polls this year. The SNP have broadly been polling in the mid 30s. They're 2 percentage points down in this poll. Labour, who are only at 19%, as you were saying, that's +1 compared to the similar Northstat poll the other month. But Reform are +4. At 18%. And of course, when you translate all of this into seats, I mean, it is really quite extraordinary on a constituency vote of 33% that the SNP would mop up most of the seats, again because of the way in which the electoral system works. Because if Labour and Reform are battling it out for second place, and the Tories are at 13%, and the Liberal Democrats are up from where they were at the last election, then what happens is that in most constituencies, the vote is sliced up. But if you have the biggest slice, even if it's only just over a third of the vote in most of the constituencies, you're going to take most of the seats. So, I mean, in terms of the electoral calculus, if the figures that you've just given were translated into seats, broadly the SNP would have 54, Labour would have 20, Reform would have 18, the Conservatives would have 17, the Liberal Democrats would be up to 11, and the Greens would be at 9. Now, 54, of course, is way short of what they would need in order to command a majority within the chamber. But based on these figures, and I think this is interesting because in the past I've talked up about the possibility if you get a really rainbow parliament, which is all over the place, you might not be able to hit the magic figure of 65 when you combine two parties. It may well be that if the SNP were either going on in a minority government on a confidence supply basis, they might need the support not of one party, but of two. But in this poll, 54 for the SNP and 11 for the Liberal Democrats would take you to the 65. And although these poll findings, in terms of the yes vote, in terms of constitutional preference, are good news, even although the SNP would still have 54 seats, I think I'm correct in saying Greens 9, 54 for the SNP. That's 63 seats for parties of pro independence. There still would be a slight unionist majority in the parliament. I think the last poll showed that there would actually be a pro independence majority in the parliament, but it's not great. It's not overwhelming. The poll is very much as you were. And I think the reading of it is that it's a plague on all of your houses, but for those that are really scunnered, they're entertaining reform.
Yes, I mean the SNP will be the largest party on these figures. And in fact, on 33%, getting 54 seats is the most disproportionate result in the history of the devolved parliament. Again, remind listeners that in 1999, the Labour Party won 56 seats, but they needed 39% of the vote to get that. And because remember, the system is supposed to, broadly speaking, award seats in proportion to the votes, the share of the vote won by parties. So in 2007, when the SNP got their majority, that was seen as breaking the system. It wasn't breaking the system; it was confirming the system, because the SNP won basically 50% of the vote in that election, and they got just over 50% of the seats. It was the system working as it's designed to. The fact is that nobody had ever thought at the time the system was drawn up that any party would be in a position to win that level of support. But so the key thing, I think, from the SNP's point of view is, yes, we can be in power, but we are not going anywhere on 33% of the vote. There is simply no way that you can reopen the constitutional question while winning only the support of only 1 in 3 voters. And remember, Nicola Sturgeon's suggestion that the last UK general election could be considered a kind of de facto referendum on independence is something that will continue to haunt the SNP in elections to come, because that set the threshold for victory again at over 50% of the votes cast, not anything about seats won. And I think that is a millstone or an anchor that will be hung around the SNP by opposition parties for many years to come. But clearly, in a multi-party situation where the anti-SNP vote is fragmented amongst 3 or 4 other parties, then it becomes easier for the SNP to win seats on a relatively low share of the vote, as of course was the case for Keir Starmer at last year's general election, where the Labour Party won a 180-seat majority, but again only on not much more than a third of the vote across the UK as a whole. And so that the national question, it is interesting that support for independence has ticked up in this poll, but also irrelevant, because the mechanism for opening that box isn't there if the SNP is only winning a third of the vote.
Well, I mean, the other thing to stress is that although the SNP would comfortably be the largest party, if the vote share was 33%, that would be a full 15 percentage points down
Mm.
on where they were at the last election. But, the SNP can only play the system as it is, just as Starmer could only play the electoral system as it is. I think the more astonishing thing is that, by the time we go into the election next year, the SNP will have been in government for 19 years. I mean, it really is embarrassing from the Labour Party's point of view. I mean, most electorates run out of patience with governments after a certain period of time. I mean, the Conservatives, after they won in '79, were in for 18 long Tory years. We used to get the complaints from Labour. And then, of course, Labour were in for 13 years. There does come a point, and it's sort of quite a natural thing, that voters from time to time want a change. And it would be remarkable if Labour can't really make significant progress, given how long the SNP have been in, and given the difficulty that they should have in defending much of the record, particularly on the economy and particularly in public services, which is why this parliamentary by-election on Thursday is really so important. Because just after the general election last year, if you to say there's going to be a Holyrood election in a constituency in Lanarkshire, 11 months into a Labour government, given what had happened in terms of the electoral dynamics between Labour and the SNP last year, SNP strategists would have just written it off. They would say there was absolutely no chance that they could hold this seat. After all, Labour only require a swing of 6%, and they were getting swings of more than 3 times that last year. So the real danger for Labour is that if they are way, way, way behind the SNP, and if the 8 polls that we have this year play out, then the SNP should win this relatively comfortably. Labour should come second, and Reform should come third. I mean, I was speaking to one or two Conservatives yesterday who, well, not only obviously do they have no chance of winning, but they don't dissent from what we have said several times in the podcast, that they'll be down around lost deposit territory. But the psychological blow to Labour that would result from the humiliation, and it would be a humiliation if they were pushed into third place by Reform, simply creates a sort of momentum behind the argument that they cannot win. So here's a question for you. Do you think Reform will get second place? And if Labour have fallen back so much in the vote in that part of Lanarkshire in an 11-month period, do you see any route, Alex, for Anas Sarwar in terms of becoming First Minister?
Well, on that second part of your question, I think at present there is no route really, unless Reform collapse completely, unless the mood around Labour at a UK level and a Scottish level, and I think it has to be both because the two are linked, changes significantly, unless Labour can focus and persuade people of Scotland next May that not only is it time for a change of government, and I think there is a majority there for that. And the fact that the weakness of the SNP's polling numbers suggests that a lot of people are open to the idea that it is time for a change after 2 decades of SNP administration. But secondly, Labour must then say, and we are the people to bring that change. That second question is much, much harder for Labour to answer in a positive way at the moment, because I don't think people look at what Labour have done at a British level and think that that is a recipe that they want to see repeated at a Holyrood level. And this is why, again, as we've said before, Anas Sarwar's fortunes are intimately linked to Keir Starmer's fortunes. And if the Prime Minister is massively unpopular in Scotland, and he has an approval rating in Scotland of -39, which compares with, interestingly, Nigel Farage's approval rating at the moment is, I think it's -25 or -26. So remarkably, astonishingly, Nigel Farage is currently more popular in Scotland than a Labour Prime Minister. So you put all of that together, and it seems to me that Labour's route to victory next May and to Anna Sarwar moving into Butte House is almost impossible as matters stand. Now, of course, things can change. I mean, they changed quite rapidly in the 12 months before the general election last year, but there Labour were able to offer a thing of, well, change is needed. Lend us your votes if you like, particularly to SNP supporters. Lend us your votes to get rid of the Conservatives, because we all know that it doesn't really make much difference if there are 40 SNP MPs or only 20. But they can't make that argument in a Holyrood election. So I think that's very difficult for them. When it comes to this by-election, I suppose the dirty little secret about it is that from a journalistic point of view, and it's purely from a journalistic point of view, the ideal result is obviously not just Reform coming second, but Reform winning, because that is news, genuinely news, and journalism thrives off new and unexpected things happening. An SNP victory by 3 or 4 thousand votes or whatever is a dog bites man story. SNP hold seat they've held for years. Big deal. So from the secret thing in newsrooms across the country and so on is that everybody is sort of wanting to see Reform do quite well because it gives us new things to talk about. And so there is a danger, I think, in perhaps there's a risk that the media as a whole is overhyping Reform. And even Reforms people are saying, well, we began this campaign hoping to beat the Conservatives and come third. Well, they're clearly going to do that. Can they beat Labour and come second? Yes, they can. Can they win the seat? Even Reform people are saying, well, that's still a big ask, but it's not impossible. And there are SNP insiders who think that in order of probability, the likelihood of the outcome is a reasonably comfortable SNP victory. That's the most probable outcome. The second most probable outcome, and again, this is the SNP people talking about this, is a uncomfortably narrow SNP victory. And the third most probable outcome, unlikely but not impossible, is a Reform victory.
Yes, and you're right that in newsrooms, it's not a case of people in newsrooms are pro-reform. They just like what makes stories, and a very good result for reform is absolutely a story for a whole series of reasons. I saw an interview in the Herald on Sunday, I think it was this morning, with Professor James Mitchell, Professor of Public Policy at the University of Edinburgh, someone that I know well and have a great deal of respect for, who was saying, all these analogies with Hamilton in 67 are really a bit ridiculous. People should calm down. My take on this, actually, interesting to see whether or not you agree with it. I mean, if, and it's a big if, and I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think Reform are going to win, but they're going to get a good result. The only question is how good. I don't think they'll win, but if they were to win, then in my view, it would be the most astonishing by-election victory in Scottish political history, because Hamilton in 67 is obviously the genesis of the start of the modern SNP. And if your first building block is Hamilton 67, but we have to remember that in 67, Labour were going through a sticky period economically in London when Wilson was Prime Minister. The SNP had already won a by-election in Motherwell in 45. They'd already been around for about 30 years. There was a famous West Lothian by-election where Billy Wolfe slugged it out with Tam Dalyell. They were at the forefront of the public consciousness, in a sense. They'd been around for a while. They'd time to make their argument for independence. I mean, this party has just been created. It's not been going all of that long, just over a year or so. If it were to win, and it's an English nationalist party in some respects, if
Well,
an
but
English
that's an
national,
interesting thing to talk about it, because clearly,
if an, Eng-
clearly,
if an English,
voters can't be
if a, wait a
seeing it
minute,
as
if an
such.
English, well, they don't. No, they absolutely don't. Of course they don't. But if an English nationalist party was to come and win a Scottish by-election, having just been around for over a year, I would regard that as utterly and completely, without precedent. And I will be scratching my head trying to work out in a apart from we know that voters are frustrated with the mainstream parties, but apart from what is it they see in reform? Do you think? I mean, what people who have voted Labour in that part of the world, who it was a that part of Lanarkshire was defined partly by coal mining and steel making, trade unionism, solidarity, class struggle. It's all in that part of. What is it that they see in Nigel Farage?
Well, I mean, I think it is interesting. UKIP, one of Farage's previous vehicles and so on, I think was seen by voters in Scotland as an English nationalist party. But things have moved on and things have changed, and it's quite clear to me, I think, that voters do not see reform in the same way. They do not. Uh, there's just no way that you could have, if you like, a party that was seen as an English nationalist party winning nearly 20% of the vote in across Scotland, at least according to polls. No, even it's just not credible. So something has changed, and I suppose one of the things that has changed is the decreasing salience of constitutional issues. Full stop. Whether that is Scottish independence or Brexit or whatever, that these have been replaced by more day-to-day concerns, if you like. Uh, and if you look at how Farage is positioning himself, now you may reasonably say that this is deeply cynical and all the rest of it, but he is outflanking Labour on the left on questions like welfare. So you have Farage, improbably, I would say, nevertheless saying that, of course, reform supports lifting the benefit cap on families, lifting the two-child benefit cap. Yes, reform wants to do more on welfare, a more generous welfare state. And so now you may say this is completely incongruous and inconsistent with Farage's own beliefs that, for instance, the National Health
It
Service
is.
should be well, not privatized but shifted into an insurance-based model. And you're right, those are completely inconsistent and incoherent. One of the things that reform benefits from, and this is true across the UK, and it's why it's winning seats or winning council seats, across England, uh, is is that it is not a normal political party. It's not even a political movement. It is an expression of a sensibility, of a dissatisfaction with politics as they've been, a dissatisfaction with the nonsense that supplies, that surrounds a lot of politics. And Farage and reforms people are prepared to say, "Hang on a minute, this is nonsense." And in a time when other parties are, often quite mealy mouthed about things, or there is a consensus on things like, for example, net zero, that this is just a sort of unquestionable good, and anything that gets us further along that line must be done, regardless of cost or inconvenience and so on. There is a space there for a party that says, well, hang on a minute, have you all gone mad? Um, and you have a lot of voters who are dissatisfied with the SNP, well, they've never liked the SNP anyway, but they're also not ready to forgive the Conservatives for the excesses of their failures in over 14 years of administration at Westminster, and they are deeply unimpressed by the way Keir Starmer has approached his first year as Prime Minister, and Rachel Reeves and all the rest of it, and the winter fuel payments and benefits cuts and various other things, and the clear sense of, well, what is Labour's big organising idea? What is the Labour Party for, and who is it for? When you put all of that together and you add in other elements, sort of the nativist elements, I suspect, which we should talk about as well, then you create a vehicle that just can sort of suck up discontent from all parts of the country. And reform is particularly strong amongst men, and particularly strong amongst working class men. If you dig into the detail of some of the recent opinion polls, you find that the Labour Party's real problem in Scotland is not in middle class Scotland, where Labour continues to fight the SNP reasonably, hand to hand, and do reasonably well vis-a-vis the SNP amongst middle class voters. The people that Labour are really struggling with in Scotland are people who live on the housing estates, where the SNP continues to have around 50% support of people in social housing. But reform are now at around, one in four people living in council houses in Scotland is minded to vote reform. far more than currently intending to vote Labour. That is where Labour's real problem lies in
Mm.
Scotland, and that I think is not so much just Labour's problem. It's seen as it's a sort of consequence of a general political failing of leadership at a UK level, but also to some extent at a Scottish level.
Yeah, I think this week was quite interesting in relation to Reform's journey, because Farage's comments on winter fuel payments and the two-child benefit cap, I mean, are completely and utterly inconsistent with,
Mhm,
how can I put it, his lifetime's politics. What it tells me is that, first of all, Farage has just decided, I won't bother about the Tories, because the electorate are
mhm,
not bothering about the Tories in terms of wanting to support them. So, mopping up or hoovering up votes, Tory votes, is already done. It's mission accomplished. What I really need to do is to now go after Labour. But what he's doing is that he's going after Labour not by enunciating what he really has traditionally believed, because if one looks at where he traditionally comes from, he would be saying the welfare bill is too big
mhm,
because the state is too big. I want a smaller state. I want tax cuts, and I'm going to fund tax cuts as a result of cutting public expenditure because the state is too big. That's where Nigel Farage's politics come from. And of course, we have this absurd policy, which has been flagged up again, of raising the personal allowance to £20,000 per year. Now, that would amount to probably the biggest tax cut that any government has ever introduced in
mhm,
the whole history of the country, should it ever see the light of day, which incidentally it won't. And the cost of raising the personal allowance to £20,000, the IFS have said, would be between 50 and 70 billion pounds. Between 50 and 70 billion pounds. Now, that's a lot of cutting in public expenditure. So that's not going to happen. He's having to cut by 50 to 70, or find 50 to 70 billion pounds. But this week he's already committed to higher public expenditure because of what he's saying on winter fuel payments, and because of what he's saying the two-child benefit cap. It's completely inconsistent with his politics hitherto. But of course, this isn't about his political philosophy. This is about political positioning,
mhm,
because having mopped up the Tories and having dealt with the Tories, he's now going after Labour. And there's a curious sense in which, if reform, and there was a UK opinion poll this week saying that he would indeed be Prime Minister after a general election. If this continues, I mean, I can see this refinement in the political offer changing, because, as you say, he will need something which is discreet for the Labour vote. But, Labour strategists in Hamilton must be wondering what all of this means for them, given I think that he's due to be in Scotland tomorrow.
mhm,
He may well be in the constituency tomorrow. It would be a complete humiliation if the Labour Party can't come second. But, and I really have to say this, and it's not about being anti-Labour or anything like that. I've seen by-elections in the past where parties have, if we can put it kindly, shielded their candidates from
mhm,
media scrutiny, and in other instances tried to hide their candidates altogether. If you put somebody up who has to do a job of work on behalf of constituents, who fundamentally has to be an advocate for constituency interests, who has to represent the constituency, be the public face of the constituency in Parliament, and get redress for individuals and community groups, then the very least that you can expect your candidate to do is to be able to defend their political position in public. The Labour Party have frankly insulted the voters of this constituency by shielding their candidate in the way in which they have. Any political party in a by election situation who puts up a candidate for the votes of the public, but doesn't trust that candidate to go before the public in terms of public meetings or hold themselves to account in front of journalists, well, I don't think that. I don't think it's healthy for the election. I don't think it's healthy for democracy. But there we are. That's the way the Labour Party have decided to play it. I think we even got a situation where he was a no-show at a public meeting the other evening, and the Tory candidate thought, "Well, what's the point?" and actually walked out on the meeting before it started.
Well, we
So
all feel like
there's a
that
message for all
sometimes.
the candidates. Yeah, if you're the message for all the candidates, if you're taking by-elections seriously, and if you're taking the voters seriously, then select a candidate who's serious.
Sure, sure. I mean, the thing about reform, though, is again, I think one has to come back to this as well, is that they're an idea or a feeling, a mood, and reform's lack of distinct Scottish policies. We're told that they are going to roll out a few Scottish-specific ideas in the coming weeks, but their lack of any policies, their lack of any recognisable figures in Scotland, currently, I believe, works to reform's advantage, because it allows everyone to project an ideal form of dissatisfaction onto reform, and it allows it to be a big baggy basket that can hold, cries of despair and outrage and all the rest of it from diverse segments of society. Its incoherence is its strength at present, and as soon as reform actually start having a political agenda in Scotland, and as soon as they have people that they have to put on television regularly who become slightly recognizable figures, then things start to become more difficult for reform, because it has to become more like a traditional political party and not just this sort of vehicle for the expression of dissatisfaction. In terms of Farage's positioning, let me put this to you, Bernard. Keir Starmer has started talking about Farage in terms of, well, look, vote Farage, get Truss. That his economics are the same as Liz Truss's economics, and that reform are essentially a rehash of Liz Truss on steroids and so on. Now, Liz Truss is also politically homeless at present. It seems to me that there could be a situation, and I just put this out there just as a little provocation, perhaps, that where Liz Truss applies to join reform, and Farage says to her, "No, you're not welcome here. You are the political, the economic version of Tommy Robinson." And I've been very clear that I don't want to have Tommy Robinson in my party, even if I'm happy to have the votes of people who might sympathise with Tommy Robinson. And I'm not, Liz Truss, not good enough for reform.
That may well be right. I have absolutely no insight into what Farage would do in that circumstance. I think he's more likely, incidentally, to get a whole series of defections. I mean, if you're a Conservative MP and you want a degree of longevity in terms of your political career, and you're looking at the polls which are not moving, and if Farage continues to be the game in town in terms of right wing politics, you probably ask yourself at some stage, do I jump ship?
And that applies to
Um,
MSPs as well. I mean, there are a couple of
yes,
Tory MSPs who
yes,
are, if you like, on reform watch at present,
yes,
because
yes.
jump to reform, get the top place on a regional list. That is as you say, if you're looking out for yourself in your own political career, your nice parliamentary pension, and all the rest of it, then that might well be more attractive than being third on the Conservative list in one of the regions next May.
Absolutely, because again, the 8 polls that we have this year would suggest that the miserable performance that the Tories got in Scotland at the last general election will be replicated next year. And I can find no credible evidence or indeed any reason to say that those polls will not be
Mhm,
borne out.
mhm,
I think, I mean, the Tories probably, and it's only a question of when, the Parliamentary Conservative Party will panic at some point, and they will simply push the ejector seat on Kemi Badenoch and replace her with somebody else, probably. Or probably Robert Jenrick, and they'll give that a go and see how it goes. But if there's no material turnaround and you're staring defeat in the face, I suspect quite a lot of Conservatives will think about jumping ship. In terms of what Starmer does in relation to Farage, well, I'm afraid that trying to hijack his rhetoric on issues like immigration will be completely and utterly counterproductive. You're simply dancing to his tune on that kind of agenda. And this is where there might be a sort of little chink of light for Scottish Labour next year in this. Um, I've always said, I think from indeed before the general election last year, that I thought that Labour would get round to doing something in the two-child benefit cap. It looks as if that's now on the horizon. It looks as if there will be a U-turn in winter fuel payments, and there may well be in relation to welfare spending tinkering there. So we may well get to the second Labour budget later on in the year, which will be undoing
Mhm.
a lot of what has made them popular in the first
You mean
year.
unpopular?
There are unpopular,
Yeah.
unpopular in the last year. That could have two consequences. One is that the heat that Anas Sarwar has had to take as a consequence of those decisions, he may well find that he can get onto sort of slightly better terrain. But if Labour are making financial decisions on things like winter fuel payments that the SNP do not need to mitigate, it puts the SNP in a stronger financial position for their
Mhm.
budget.
Yeah, I mean the other thing, Bernard, I think that we should talk about and so on because it has obviously dominated quite a lot of the, if you like, the air war in the Hamilton by-election is the issue of race and the way in which Reform have made allegations and they've doubled down on these that that Anas Sarwar would prioritise the interests of the Asian community, specifically the Pakistani community in Scotland, over those of, we are invited to suspect, the white majority of people in Scotland. Nigel Farage is, sort of questioned or allowed, to sort of hint at, does Anna Sarwar share British values, whatever those may be? And there's obviously been a degree of, united condemnation of this, not just from the Labour Party, but also from the SNP, accusing Reform of running an openly racist campaign in this by-election. What's your view of this, and how significant are the charges against Reform on this? How accurate are they? What sort of impact would you think this will have on voter behaviour and voter attitudes?
Um, it's difficult to assess because, I mean, people like ourselves who sit and talk about these things don't go and knock on doors. I mean, I've not spoken to any activists to see whether or not there's been any kickback on this. On the specifics of the case, I mean, that graphic with the words about prioritizing the Pakistani community are not what was said. And in fact, the Reform candidate in the constituency has said, no, those are our words. Those are our interpretation
Mhm.
of what he was saying. Anybody who knows Anas Sarwar will know that he would not prioritize the interests of any community over the other. And there is nothing which I think he has ever said in any speech in the past which would make that kind of charge acceptable. So it was a deliberate this interpretation, and putting a race interpretation on this was completely and utterly deliberate. And then when there was pretty uniform condemnation, although I don't know if the Tories actually put out a statement on this, but certainly I saw Lib Dems, SNP, and Labour people, Greens, all condemn it. Farage at that press event in London doubles down by saying that this was Sarwar introducing an element of sectarianism into Scottish politics.
Yes,
Sectarianism in Lanarkshire. Who would have
I know
thunk?
it did suggest a certain lack of familiarity with the history of Lanarkshire politics.
Look. I think we can take it as read that uh, the Farage is not across Scottish politics. I remember at the Aberdeen Donside by-election, doorstepping Farage, where he actually made a comparison. He made a comparison between the SNP and the EDL.
Mhm.
He actually made the comparison. And when I pushed him on this, he said, well, quite a lot of the founders of the SNP might not have had any difficulty with the politics of the EDL. I asked him who he was thinking of. He couldn't name anyone. And he said, well, they changed their tune once they won that famous by-election. I said, which one was that? He said, the Falkirk by-election. I said, well, they didn't win a by-election at Falkirk. There was a by-election in at Falkirk, I think, in 1971. He didn't know anything about this, tied himself in knots. And, he's not across the details and the sensitivities. I mean, if he was talking about, well, sectarianism doesn't, of course, have to be just religious. But if he knew anything about West of Scotland politics, he would maybe think twice about using that view. But I just thought that the interpretation that was put on the Sarwar speech was utterly deplorable. Utterly
Yeah, I mean,
deplorable.
because what it was, essentially, it's a big gala dinner of, the Asian community in Scotland, and there was a degree of celebration and backslapping and so on. Look, we have we now for the first time ever and so on in Anna Sarwar and Hamza Yusuf as well, of course, have Scots Asians in positions of political responsibility and opportunity. In the same way, you would once upon a time have had exactly the same kind of thing said at dinners of the Scots-Irish community or the Irish community in Scotland or the Catholic community or whatever. None of this was revelatory or revolutionary. It wasn't a suggestion that the march of Sharia law, will soon be spreading across Scotland and so on. Far from it, but that is the sort of interpretation that people are asked to put on it. It's not quite said openly, but there's with a nod and a wink and a nudge and all the rest of it. And we know what's going on there. It's quite clear, and it does tap into this, say that there is a sense on parts of the right, the far right, if you like, that white people in Britain are now marginalised and oppressed on the basis of their race. As I say, this is preposterous, but there are from time to time just occasional anecdotal pieces of evidence that help give a semi-plausible veneer to what is overall absolute nonsense. But this sense of embattlement and being, that you could say things about white people that you couldn't possibly say about black or brown people is increasingly apparent on the fringes of the far right. So Hamza Yusuf's speech in 2020 in a debate in the Scottish Parliament on Black Lives Matter and after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and Anna Sarwar made a similar speech in this, so that has become a sort of cause célèbre on the right, where Hamza was talking about how, look, everybody in senior positions in Scotland is white. All the judges in the Court of Session are white and so on. And you have quite a lot of people, I think, who say, well, yeah, okay, but then almost everybody in Scotland is white. So you would expect this. And it's not something necessarily deplorable. It isn't necessarily evidence of institutionalized racism and all the rest of it and so on. And it's stuff like that that reform has fed upon and is an important part, I think, of their current success. That why, so you have reform say, why can't we just judge everybody by their abilities, etc., etc., etc. Now, of course, this is a great simplification of lots of things, but nevertheless, you can see why, because it's a very simple and coherent message, why it cuts through with certain voters.
Yeah, yeah. I think we've given that a good run.
Mhm.
We wanted to mark a couple of issues,
Mhm.
stuff that's come up in the papers. There's a defence story that's caught your eye. I was just looking at yet another report from the IFS, which is talking about some of the difficult spending choices which Rachel Reeves is going to have to deal with later in the year. We're going to get a statement in a couple of weeks about the direction of travel of public expenditure. And they're basically making the point that in terms of, or out with protected areas, health, education, and defence, they're going to have some really, really difficult choices. Of course, in the budget last year, we had increased expenditure, but in terms of the way in which the government have profiled increases in public expenditure, it's all been front loaded this year and next. In years 3 and 4, it tails off and is barely an overall increase in real terms. So again, I think that this will help us understand what may well come out of the budget later on in the year, because we know they've had to find additional money for defence. There was 2.3 billion which they had to find. They're going to have to find more money if they're going to do the U-turn on winter fuel payments, two-child benefit tax. I mean, if they were going to restore the policy in full and the full policy on winter fuel payments, we're talking about 5 billion, and that's before they even revisit the issue of welfare. So there's a lot of stuff kicking about. I think the statement which comes in the next couple of weeks will no doubt come back to that in a future podcast, because it'll be quite important in terms of what we'll get in that budget. But of course, all of the issue on defence spending and munitions, and John Healy's all over the papers today. That story's caught your eye.
Yeah, I mean, Lord Robertson of Port Ellen, his Defence Review is to be published this week, um, and it's been delayed a little bit. I think Lord Robertson has been on manoeuvres to make sure that it lands well, not just with the MOD, but most importantly with the Treasury, and that it can't just be written off as a kind of, quasi think tank report. Very interesting, but we'll put it in a filing cabinet and consider it at some point in the future, which always means never. It is quite clear that defence spending is going to have to increase more rapidly than is currently envisaged. The talk of getting to 3% of GDP at some point in the next parliament is, I think, almost certainly going to have to be accelerated to being by the end of this decade, really by the end of this parliament. And one of we're getting little intimations of what Lord Robertson is recommending. Clearly, a big focus on restoring British manufacturing capacity for munitions, shells, ammunition, and so on, which, of course, supplies of these have been depleted, partly as a result of the assistance given to Ukraine. But the UK must have a much more robust and self-sufficient defence industry, and that means spending a lot more. And there's a little row between Labour and the SNP about that this morning. Rolls-Royce, for instance, want to establish a world-class, highly specialised welding centre in Glasgow for work on Royal Navy ships and so on. The Defence Review seems likely to recommend a significant increase in the size of the Royal Navy. Uh, and there is a row broken out over the sort of public support for this welding centre. Rolls-Royce saying that they'd approached Scottish Enterprise for about £2.5 million of support, which is a pretty small amount of money, really, and been told no. And the grounds for this is the Scottish Government and its agencies have a policy of not investing or supporting defence-related manufacturing of armaments. Rolls-Royce would say that this welding centre doesn't actually do that. But the broader question of, should public money be going to support, defence contractors like this and so on, it seems to me that absolutely obviously, yes, that's the case. A core duty of the state is the defence of the realm. And so you have Labour say, well, we will fund it. We will step in where the Scottish Government doesn't. And protect jobs, create jobs, etc., etc., etc. But more generally, take the view that defence is a serious matter, and that the SNP's hostility to the defence sector, as Labour allege, is evidence of student union politics, as John Healy, the Defence Secretary, put it this morning. And I think he has a plausible case there. When the question of making arms comes up, most people in the Scottish Parliament take the view, that's sort of hard, difficult politics and so on. And we don't like hard and difficult things, and guns and bombs are unpleasant. So, no, we're above all of that because we're morally better and superior to people who do have to trouble themselves with life in the real world.
Well, talking about student union politics, of course, in student unions, you get a lot of barracking and bad behaviour. And this week, indeed, in the Holyrood Chamber, the presiding officer, Alison Johnson, effectively removed Douglas Ross for, I think John Bercow used to put it, chuntering from a sedentary position.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I sort of
Sounds much
looked at
more
the thing.
perverted than it really is.
Yes, chuntering. Let's all chunter from a sedentary position. And I did think to myself, they all shout and bawl. in the chamber. They all shout and bawl and they intervene. And I thought, it's a bit heavy handed. She could have told them, like, shut up and that's it. But she effectively ordered them from the chamber. I thought it was a bit heavy handed given that they're all at it. And indeed, there was a tweet from Lord Fowkes of Cumnock, the Labour grandee, who was making the point, and he is no stranger to chuntering from a sedentary position. Let me tell
All
you,
sorts of other things from a
um,
sedentary position.
and he's also guilty of chuntering from a standing position as well. I mean, I remember many years ago. He denounced Douglas Hogg, who was on the Conservative
Mhm.
front bench at the time, as an arrogant little shit. And uh, the now Baron Fowkes was asked to withdraw. And then he said, "What would you like me to withdraw? Arrogant, little, or shit?" So, this kind of sort of knockabout goes on in politics. And, we, particularly in the House of Commons, speakers are constantly telling people to mind their language. I just thought this was completely and utterly heavy handed. Douglas Ross, I'm told, is absolutely furious and apparently went straight down and demanded to see the presiding officers. So there's also a feeling that the Tories believe that she's harder on them than she is on others. And you know what? As somebody who watches the chamber from time to time, never thought I would say this. I have some sympathy with the Tories in this
Yeah,
one.
well, I mean, over the years, John Swinney has been one of the most sort of inveterate hecklers from the nationalist benches and so on, and I don't recall him ever being expelled from the chamber. And of course, things are slightly different now that he's first minister, but nevertheless, the point stands. It is true that people watching politics, whether it's the House of Commons or Holyrood and so on, by and large deplore the sort of Glasgow University Union, Yahoo, Yahoos, and all the rest of it, and so on. That they don't actually like watching this. Whereas most people, if you like, in the game, inside the bubble, whether they're in politics or in the media and so on, actually like it. And
Here,
most journalists
here,
at
here.
Holyrood would much rather, have Holyrood conduct its affairs with the sort of raucous, boisterous atmosphere of the House of Commons than the sort of sepulchral holiness with which Holyrood prefers to conduct its business. But of course, when the Parliament was set up, it was deliberately designed to act and have standing orders that would be different, that would differentiate itself from the House of Commons. And so, if the House of Commons was seemed to be behaving badly, or have a culture of behaving badly and abusing speakers and all the rest of it, then Holyrood would deliberately take a different path, rather in the way that Scottish football supporters learnt to behave themselves, to distinguish themselves in contrast to English football supporters who were disgracing themselves across the European continent. So something similar took place in terms of the setting up the Scottish Parliament, with the result that it's often a terribly boring place. And I thought Douglas Ross, he what he should have complained about was not being expelled for one day, but he should have asked, why haven't I been let off for a week or a month? Ban me for a month so I don't have to spend any more time here. That would make him, the envy of all his peers.
Right, boisterous or not, we'll be back with our next podcast, which will be unpicking the result of the by-election in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse, and asking what it means for Scottish politics in the run-up to the Holyrood poll next year. But for the moment, from me, it's
And
goodbye.
it's goodbye from me.